Do many rock legends still haunt the locations where they performed, recorded, or resided, or other locations they had meaningful connections to? What is the connection between rock and roll and the occult? Does music take us to a deeper level of consciousness and help bring us into a higher spiritual realm? Matthew Swayne, author of Haunted Rock and Roll, joins me to explore these questions and the haunted stories associated with many rock legends. Greetings and welcome to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and it's so wonderful to be back here with you once again. Happy New Year, everybody. Happy 2020. Wow, that has an interesting ring to it, doesn't it? And I've got a great guest joining me, and two things that we're going to be talking about, and two things that I really love, and that is rock and roll and the paranormal. So I'll be talking with Matthew Swayne about his book, Haunted Rock and Roll. And it's going to be amazing to have this discussion because, again, I can't think of two better topics to combine than rock and roll and the paranormal. He's going to be talking about some haunted stories associated with rock legends, and we're going to be talking about a lot more, too. So it's really exciting to have him joining me on the show. If you haven't been over to the website, please pay it a visit at passion4theparanormal.com. There you can do some cool things. You can catch up with past episodes. You can access some of the new Passion for the Paranormal merchandise. You can purchase hoodies, t-shirts. You can also purchase coffee mugs. It all goes to support the show. And they're also great gifts. So check those out on the website. And I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday season. And here we are launching into 2020. I'm so excited. Really looking forward to some great shows in this year. And what a way to start out the year with this discussion I'm going to have with Matthew. And also make sure you stop over to the Facebook page at facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the paranormal. Make sure you like and follow us there. You can also find a link to the Passion for the Paranormal Facebook group where we talk about a lot of the cool topics like I talk about on this show. And well, hopefully, if you're interested, you can hop on over and check out the group page as well. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into this discussion. One other quick mention is if you know of any family, friends, co-workers you think that would like to tune into the show, please share a link with them. And let's get into this discussion. It's going to be a lot of fun. And thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so my guest tonight is Matthew Swayne, and Matthew is a journalist who currently works as a research writer at Penn State. Matt has worked as a reporter and a music reviewer for several newspapers and online outlets. He is also author of several books to include Haunted Rock and Roll, which is the book we are going to be discussing tonight. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. This subject matter is kind of near and dear to my heart, so I was really pleased that you reached out to talk so that we could talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And two things near and dear to my heart, that's rock and roll and the paranormal. Former guitarist, I don't play much anymore, but, that's always been a pursuit of mine, and the paranormal as well. So two great topics to talk about together. Maybe if you could, Matthew, take us back a little bit about how this journey started for you and how you started writing about the paranormal and how these two topics came together for you.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to make it quick. I was born on Halloween, so I kind of blame that for most of my career choices. But for me, I've just always been interested in the supernatural, the paranormal, the occult, horror movies, science fiction, anything fringy. I was always interested in exploring. I've always been, I would say, curious about it. How I describe myself is more of, I take a journalist approach to this, but I describe myself as an open-minded skeptic. And for me, the idea germinated when I was a newspaper reporter. And, since I was born on Halloween, I wanted to make sure I had a really good Halloween feature story every year. So that was kind of my big thing. And one year I had run out of, stories about, people making haunted houses and, people in parades and things like that. So I decided I would get into some of the ghost stories and legends around the area that I lived in. And I quickly grabbed a couple stories of ghost lore from around where I live. It was Tyrone, Pennsylvania, and I worked at a newspaper called the Daily Herald. And so I, came up with this story, and then I also took some time and researched some of the stories that were going on at Penn State at the time. Penn State has this huge paranormal history and reputation, and so I used some of that in this story. And what I found was the reaction to that story was bigger and better than anything that I really ever wrote as a journalist. So, in the back of my head, I thought, wow, this is a really, interesting topic. I liked writing it. People liked reading it. So I ended up trying to pursue more of an approach with the ghost stories of Penn State. I self-published a book on the Penn State ghost stories, and then a national publisher, Llewellyn, asked me to do a book about university ghost stories. So I did that, and then at the end of that, they asked me if I wanted to write another one, and I said, sure. And to be honest with you, I had no idea what I was going to write about, but I had read a book by R. Gary Patterson called Take a Walk on the Dark Side, which Gary has passed away, but it is an exceptional book about the occult origins of mainly rock music. And the reason I liked it so much, it approached these supernatural tales that are often kind of just thrown out there as mere entertainment. First of all, he's a great storyteller, but also it was a very serious approach to this, and so I wanted to do something similar, but more connected to the ghost side of things, whereas Gary kind of looked at the occult legends. And I ended up kind of doing a smish-smash between the two. The book has some of these occult stories that Gary talked about, but then I delved into more of the paranormal stories, the ghost stories. And so that's how I got from there to here.
Interesting. And you cover so many different artists and, old-time rock and rollers, blues artists. I mean, Robert Johnson, Elvis, Buddy Holly, John Lennon, Jim Morrison of the Doors, Michael Jackson, Black Sabbath, Brian Johnson, Janis Joplin, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, and more. These are just some of the big ones that I noted as I went through some of the book, but some amazing stories here. I want to start with one of the first ones you cover in the book, and this is going back to the 1930s and the blues era in Mississippi and the Deep South, and that is the story about the legendary bluesman Robert Johnson. This story inspired the 1986 movie Crossroads with Ralph Macchio. Some call this man the first true rock star. Can you talk a little bit about this story, the story behind Robert Johnson, and how some believe he may even struck a deal with the devil himself for fame?
Sure. And I always like to preface this because some of the questions I get is, why did you write about ghost stories of rock and roll? And really, the history of rock and roll starts with a ghost story of a kind, which is this story about Robert Johnson. And if your audience doesn't know who Robert Johnson is, Robert Johnson's now considered the greatest, blues man that ever lived, the greatest blues guitar player. He gets acclaim from people like Eric Clapton and Keith Richards. I just heard an interview, I think, with Eric Clapton, who said he still can't replicate the things that Robert Johnson did. If you listen to his music, sometimes it sounds like there are 2 or 3 guitar players in there playing with him, but it's actually just him. But the story is that it didn't start out that way for Robert. Robert Johnson was African American in the Delta region of the Mississippi, where you have real limited opportunities at that time. You could either be a sharecropper, work on the farms, or play play the blues. And what Robert Johnson saw very quickly was that the blues players in that area, some of the finest musicians this country ever had, he found that their lifestyle was a little easier than some of the farmhands that he saw. They usually had lots of wine. They usually had good-looking women around. And so his biggest drive was to become a good blues guitar player. And there was a little bit of a snag in that plan, is that he was kind of a crappy guitar player, believe it or not. Some of the blues players at the time, like Son House, who was probably the most highly regarded blues guitarist at the time, kind of said that Robert Johnson was an average guitar player, nothing special, but he was also a little bit annoying. And Son said that he was always, picking the guitar players for, tricks and licks and trying to get lessons from them. And eventually they got tired of it. And, the history has a few different versions of this, but the one kind of common version is that they basically kicked him out of the circle. He disappears for about a year. And then kind of the most evocative story is that Son House and some of these other blues players were playing a gig at a bar, and they had a break. And so during the break, they left, and they were out in the parking lot drinking a little and smoking a little, and they heard this amazing sound coming from inside the bar. And they did a quick head count, and everybody was there at the parking lot, so they didn't know who this was. And they went in, and there is Robert Johnson on stage playing in a way that has never been played before. His technique is professional. It's actually better than anybody else there. And the other thing they described was that he could not just play the blues, but he was playing his own variation. And so there's also kind of these chilling stories about when he would play, when the light would hit him just right, he had a cataract in his eyes, and it would look like his eyes were pure white. It was just a kind of this freakish figure up there. So there was a legend, that has stretched back for centuries about the idea of someone who wants something so much that they sell their soul to the devil. And in the Delta region, there's a legend that if you go to the Crossroads at midnight, and you'll meet a man, very tall man, dressed all in black. And in Robert Johnson's case, this man appeared at midnight and took the guitar, Robert Johnson's guitar, and retuned it and then handed it back. And then Robert Johnson signs a contract basically giving the devil his soul, and he gets what he wants, which is this fame and fortune. The story then goes on that Robert Johnson, for about 2 years or so, just had mastered the circuit, and he was well known, and everyone loved him. He had all the things that he wanted, and then suddenly he gets violently ill and dies. And for most of the people in the Delta who really truly believe this, that was the devil who came back to reclaim his soul. And of course, Robert Johnson, throughout his career, had made references to this. He was not, if this was a rumor that was being passed around about him that he wanted to quash, he didn't do a very good job of it, because a lot of the songs that he wrote, reference this, like Me and the Devil Blues and Crossroad Blues. So that's the story of Robert Johnson, and that really kicks off this occult theme, this supernatural theme that runs through rock and roll music to this day.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that certainly is a fascinating story, and I do remember seeing the movie Crossroads, and again, not the exact story of Robert Johnson, but kind of inspired by it.
And I should also point out that the Crossroads has become, there's a story that I talk about. I don't know whether I talk about it in Haunted Rock and Roll or in my second book, but there's a story that there's a story about John Lennon in England. The devil appears on a bridge, and there's a story that in his case, John Lennon sold his soul for the devil for 10 years of fame and fortune, and he did this, or 20 years of fame and fortune, and he did this in 1960.
The other big one that you talk about early on in the book is, of course, what many consider the king of rock and roll, Elvis. And one of the stories was about Beale Street in Memphis and how people had saw what they believed to be the ghost of Elvis. But just curious, why do you think this may have been a location where people believe they spotted him?
Yeah, the interesting thing when I covered the ghost stories about Elvis is that Elvis's ghosts, just like him, he's the king of rock and roll, and he's the king of rock and roll ghost stories because all of the ghost stories about Elvis appear all throughout the country in places where his sightings at Graceland. And, there are a couple stories about, well, first of all, Graceland might have been haunted before. I didn't get any stories before Elvis took over, which would have been very fascinating, but I couldn't find anything about that. But one of the stories is that after Gladys passed away, she haunted the mansion that the king owned. And there were stories about Elvis's grandmother would hear boxes being moved in the attic. And then there's a story that Priscilla Presley, Elvis's wife, when she just moved in, or right after Gladys died, during a thunderstorm, and this seems crazy to me. I mean, if there's a thunderstorm, the last thing you want to do, paranormally speaking, is go into the attic. But Priscilla said that she went to the attic and she saw these boxes were opened, and she looked in and there was a dress, and she tried it on, and she said as she tried this dress on, she could feel someone hugging her, and she always thought that was Gladys, because she didn't know Gladys really that well. Gladys had passed away pretty much as they were as Elvis and she were starting to date. So Graceland is probably the most famous haunted spot connected with Elvis. But I don't know whether you've ever been to Memphis, and I have. And when you're in Memphis, at least because I'm a big Elvis fan, you can feel his presence in that town. So it doesn't really surprise much that this town kind of has that aura of these Elvis ghost sightings. There are other places in Memphis that are rumored to be haunted, maybe not necessarily connected to the king of rock and roll, but definitely connected to rock and roll. Ernestine and Hazel's is probably one of the most famous bars in Memphis. I'm sure Elvis would have been familiar with the area because it was on Beale Street, and there are several ghost stories revolving around that bar. I talked to one of the ghost hunters who had a few very dramatic experiences. One actually seeing a full body. He told me he saw a full bodied apparition. Was able to get a video of it. He has also had various interactions with the jukebox there. It seems to be able to communicate to him. So there are some fascinating stories about Elvis and the ghosts of rock and roll in Memphis.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. What I'd like to do here is take a short break. We will be right back and pick up with the Elvis ghost stories. Okay, so I'm back here talking with Matthew Swayne about haunted rock and roll in his book, his 2014 book. Matthew, we were just talking a little bit about some of the ghostly sightings of Elvis in Memphis and Graceland. Now, you also cover a few other locations where Elvis, people say they've spotted Elvis's ghost. One of the interesting ones, he performed a lot, of course, in Las Vegas, as many other entertainers did. Can you talk a little bit about, I think one of them you mentioned was the Las Vegas Hilton, some of the sightings there. Can you talk a little bit about some of the experiences or some of the encounters that has happened there and in Vegas?
Yeah, I think one of the most famous was at the Las Vegas Hilton. And, to be honest with you, I don't know whether that's still there. Things change so quickly in Las Vegas. But Las Vegas Hilton was one of the places where Elvis had performed and, became part of that whole Vegas era Elvis that a lot of people love so much. But even today, there's still stories, or, when I wrote the book, there were still stories about people seeing Elvis in the wings by the stage, and there was even a story about a stagehand who claimed to see Elvis, walking backstage, and they actually saw Elvis in the service elevator. So, that's one of the more famous ghost stories about Elvis there. The hard thing that I found writing about Elvis is Elvis ghost stories are kind of multi-tiered. There's one sort of story that suggests that it's Elvis and his ghost that you see in these hotels and places like that. And then there's this other idea that Elvis is, there's so many people that dressed like Elvis in Las Vegas, so are people actually just seeing someone dressed like Elvis? And then the third possibility that always crops up, and especially with Elvis ghost stories in Memphis, and there was one ghost story in Memphis. In fact, it was kind of a famous photograph that was passed around back in the 70s. Immediately after he died, there's a picture that seems to show a person who looks like Elvis sitting in the bathhouse by the swimming pool of Graceland. And a lot of these rumors are that it's the ghost of Elvis, but then other people say Elvis is alive, and this is evidence that he's alive. There's another factor, is that Elvis had a lot of hanger-ons, the Memphis Mafia, and they kind of look like Elvis, wore his hairstyle similar, wore sunglasses like Elvis, dressed like Elvis. So it could be just one of the Memphis Mafia sitting in there, and then the camera kind of distorts the image through the mirror, through the windows. So Elvis ghost stories in Las Vegas have a little bit of that difficulty in determining whether, we're actually looking at the ghost of Elvis or not.
Yeah, you hear so many stories of Elvis sightings all over the place, and as you mentioned, stories of people saying they don't believe he actually did die. Now, wasn't there a misspelling on his birth or his death certificate? I thought there was some mention of that in the book, which kind of is an interesting twist.
Yeah, I didn't get too much into the whole Elvis is dead, Elvis is alive thing. I do know the story that when Elvis was born, I think on his birth certificate it's spelled Aron, but on the death certificate, I might be swapping these. I think it's Aaron. And then I'm wondering at the meditation garden on the gravestone whether it's not Aaron. There's a couple explanations for that, and one might be that Elvis's parents were very they were country people, rural stock. I don't know how far they went in their education, but they may have just misspelled it and thought it was Aron, and then later, as a way to kind of make up for that, they spelled it with the two A's. I'm not so sure what that means.
That certainly sounds like a plausible explanation for it. Perhaps the birth certificate had the misspelling. You also cover an interesting story that covers the Rolling Stones, another very famous early rock and roll band, and a band member that I was not aware of. I guess this was an early band member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Johnson, and there's kind of an interesting story behind his death that is associated with Mick Jagger and his girlfriend, and something to do with Chinese fortune-telling coins. And can you touch on that a little bit, that story, and how that?
Sure. Brian Jones was, I could probably say Brian Jones would have considered the Rolling Stones his band. It was not Mick and Keith's. It was his. And he was a pivotal figure for the Rolling Stones. And, let's just talk a little bit about Brian Jones, because one of the kind of the side benefits of writing this book was that I learned a lot. I always thought Brian Jones was sort of the kind of a sideman in the Rolling Stones. But actually, the more I read about Brian Jones, the more I kind of respected him musically. He was a terrific instrumentalist, and more than one person that I read about or read their account of this time, Brian Jones could play just about any instrument they put out there for him, and not just passively, but very, very well. And that's probably the reason I think he even plays sitar on some of the songs, but harmonica, guitar, anything he could play. So he was kind of like the talent, the heart of the Rolling Stones. But what happened to Brian Jones is happens to a lot of the stories in haunted rock and roll. They drift into excess, they get into hard drugs, and Brian Jones did go into harder drugs, and he was, at the end there, and I'm trying to think of what album that would have been, but they basically said that there was only a couple times that Brian Jones was even coherent in the studio to help them with the final album. Eventually the Stones kicked him out of the band, and there's a few stories that have gone around about this, but one is that he went back to his mansion. He lived on an estate that was once owned by Milne, the guy who wrote Winnie the Pooh. So the one story is that and according to the death certificate, he died by misadventure. He drowned in the swimming pool. Later, one of the workers there claimed to have killed Brian Jones himself. So there's a lot of you start to get this vibe around Jones's death that's very similar to many paranormal accounts, where you have a tragic death, a young person at the prime of their life, and also hints of violence and tragedy. So that kind of sets this up. And there have been stories reported that people have had encounters in that estate. One of them is that a psychic was doing a television show there, and allegedly the sound man heard that as soon as this psychic was talking about Brian Jones's death and how he died accidentally, there was a scream on tape, and this psychic wondered whether that wasn't Brian Jones reaching out, trying to say, "Hey, I wasn't, I didn't die accidentally. I was murdered." There are other stories too surrounding his death, and one of the most famous ones that I found was that Mick Jagger, the lead singer, and his girlfriend at the time, Marianne Faithfull, were rolling the I Ching or the I Ching, or however you want to pronounce it, and it's a fortune-telling kind of game that from China. And you roll these sticks or dice, and then you figure out what hexagram it is, and it will give you the fortune of this person. So they asked about Brian Jones's future, because they had just kicked him out of the band, and Marianne Faithfull was very, very attached to Brian Jones. She was one of the few left in his life that really still connected with him. And they rolled these runes, and it said, I think it was something like death by water or tragedy by water, something to that effect. And it kind of freaked them out. They did it again, and they got the same reading, and then he dies, because he was either murdered or he was drowned, one way or the other. It was definitely involved water. So Marianne Faithfull writes that after that kind of chilling occult connection and just the depression that she had about losing Brian, that she became very depressed herself and went into a coma. I think she, took too many drugs and went into a coma, and she claims to have a visitation from Brian Jones, who talked to her about going back to her life and living her life again. And I think there was another story there that she saw the ghost of Brian Jones in a mirror during this whole kind of crisis that she had in her life.
It's just kind of a chilling story that it almost seems kind of prophetic that
Right.
that had happened just weeks before his death, and the rolling of the dice, and the way that had come up. It's kind of chilling, but the other side of that story that you just mentioned is quite intriguing as well. That maybe that helped her kind of turn her life around and get on track with that encounter. It's fascinating stuff. It really is. I wanted to talk a little bit about another legend and that you cover in the book, and of course that's John Lennon. You already mentioned him or talked a little bit about him early on in our conversation. There's many people that have claimed to have witnessed his spirit or his ghost. He was shot just outside of his apartment in New York City, outside the Dakota. There's also an interesting story that Robin Givens had shared. She was in an apartment building that he formerly occupied and believes she encountered John Lennon's spirit. Can you touch a little bit on that story?
Sure. There have been a couple stories, and again, I don't know whether I included them all in Haunted Rock and Roll, but there were some follow-ups as well. But, after this tragic assassination, again, you kind of feel the setup for these stories, and just the outpouring of grief, you would probably think that this might give rise to ghost stories. And sure enough, there have been several ghost stories that have circulated around about John Lennon. There was a story about a rock musician who was staying across the street from the Dakota. He looked out and he saw what he would consider John Lennon standing in front, kind of in that whole New York City vibe of his. And, I remember that this person who saw this initially thought maybe it was someone who was just dressed up like Elvis, but then he said that this guy had a glow around him. So he considered it the ghost of John Lennon. There's another story that Yoko Ono came into the room where that famous white piano from Imagine is, and John was sitting there at the piano. And then Robin Givens has this really interesting story about she had, she was going through her own difficulties, and she was staying in the apartment that John Lennon stayed in when he was in L.A. John Lennon had this period he called his lost weekend. I think it lasted 2 years, so that's a heck of a weekend. But she was in this apartment, and she claimed to be continually hearing Beatles songs, and she wasn't particularly a Beatles fan. So she really chalked that up to that place being haunted still by the ghost of John Lennon. And then throughout, the Beatles, when they were recording a few originals for the anthology project, they claimed to have some. I don't know whether I'd consider them ghost stories but very symbolic of John being with them. There was one story about the Beatles were the remaining Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo were getting in a photo shoot in the Bahamas, and a peacock walked in and flapped its feathers out in front of them, and they kind of laughed and thought, well, that's just John showing up to ruin the mood, or to make a joke or make people laugh like he usually did with the band. And then there's this other story about how there was, as they were recording, just suddenly there was this electronic noise that filtered through the session, and they picked it up, and they claimed that they thought that was Lennon trying to communicate with them. So the John Lennon ghost stories, run the gamut of some of these apparition stories to incidences where it's almost like there's signs or symbols that he's still around. This is how people kind of deal with the grief of his death, I imagine.
Sure. Yeah, and you do have to wonder how that some of these sightings may be people's imagination, that sort of thing. Of course, you have to take some of this perhaps with a grain of salt. There's another interesting story you cover in here in the book, just kind of going back a little bit in early rock and roll. And that's the story of Buddy Holly's death. Now, of course, Buddy Holly died in a plane crash with two other superstars, Ritchie Valens and J.P. Richardson. I think they referred to as the Big Bopper. Plane went down in an Iowa farm. People have visited that farm. I think you mentioned something in the book about people visiting on the anniversary of the crash. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the accounts have been of people who have visited that site?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to kind of understand the context of Buddy Holly in this. Again, you have a tragic figure, someone who was just on the cusp of, I think, really great things. As amazing as his career was, I think he was just getting started. So there's this sense of deep tragedy. I go to the place where I say that, rock and roll didn't recover from Buddy Holly's death until the Beatles. I think it was stagnant after him. But pretty much everyone knows about the day the music died when this plane crash happened. And you didn't just lose Buddy Holly, you lost Big Bopper, and you also lost Ritchie Valens in this crash. And since then, people have claimed to have witnessed some very strange activity at that crash site. Remember, it was February 3rd, 1959. That's really the day the music died. But there are some stories about people seeing orbs of light wandering through the cornfields there or around the fields. There's some other more chilling stories of on the anniversary on February 3rd, you can hear screams and the muffled sound of crash or the grinding of metal and what you might consider a residual reenacting of that accident that occurs and has been documented. Some of the other people have claimed there was another story about a visitor who was there, and they have kind of a makeshift shrine to Buddy Holly, and he said that pieces of metal started to fall off, spontaneously, and he considered that somehow connected to the presence of Buddy Holly. So a lot of stories there, and then there are also stories about his ghost haunting the Surf Ballroom, which was one of the places on an ill-fated tour of his, and the Rave Eagles, and there's even been stories that Lubbock Cemetery, where he was buried, that he haunts that cemetery as well.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Another great rock legend still alive. One of my favorites, and that is, of course, this is a story of Led Zeppelin, but more specifically, the guitar player Jimmy Page, and someone who seems to have embraced the occult and read the works of Aleister Crowley. And he had some interesting experiences, it seems. So it seems in his mansion, one of the mansions he owned, it seems like one of the stories was near Loch Ness. But can you touch on a few of those stories that you cover in the book about Jimmy Page and his experiences with the paranormal?
Yeah, it's this was kind of when I was writing this book, I felt like this was the creepiest of the stories. A lot of the stories you have with haunted rock and roll, believe it or not, are a little bit heartwarming, or make you feel like the spirits are still around and they're overall good spirits. But with anytime you talk about Aleister Crowley, you're probably not going to get happy ghost stories. But Jimmy Page became a super fan of Aleister Crowley. I think even before he formed Led Zeppelin, but definitely when Led Zeppelin hit, Jimmy Page had some money and he bought this old mansion, this old estate that Aleister Crowley used to own called Bulliskin House. Recently this place has hit some bizarre misfortunes. It's burned down, I think, twice now, and I don't know whether they're rebuilding or not. But at the time, the story is that Aleister Crowley got this estate, which is near Loch Ness, of course, which has its own supernatural legacy. But he got this mansion because it was so dark and dismal and had a terrible reputation of. There was a story that a pastor killed his congregation. There was another story that somebody killed their family. There was a story that a person had their head chopped off. It was just a mess. And, as I was writing this, I just realized that Aleister Crowley must have been the dream customer of some realtor, because this realtor had this terrible place on their hands and wanted to get rid of it, wanted to sell it, and Crowley was like, oh, this just sounds delightful. Crowley bought it because he wanted to do some of these magic spells there. And so, years later, and if you don't know who Aleister Crowley was, this would have been in the Victorian era, late Victorian era. He was somewhat of a libertine. He was a magician. He, had quite the reputation at that time. And I think he used to refer to himself kind of gleefully as the Beast. So he was had a really dark reputation. But Jimmy Page bought this house, and there were several experiences, not necessarily by Jimmy, but by some of the people that used to hang there. Kenneth Anger was a movie producer, worked with Rolling Stones, worked with Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin. He was there, and he claimed to see a painting that levitated off the wall and then kind of gently floated to the floor. So this is kind of a first-hand account from him. Of course, the thing with Led Zeppelin, with specifically these ghost stories, is when you tell a story about Kenneth Anger, of course the immediate skeptical response was, well, they were all on drugs. But Jimmy Page tells this very interesting story to I think the Rolling Stone magazine, and he told the reporter that he understood that everyone kind of thought that it was all drug related and hallucinations and whatnot, but he said he had a friend who stayed there, who wasn't on drugs, who didn't drink, who was sleeping in the one room and heard this kind of rumpling around in the hall. It sounded like a ball rolling down the hall. So the next morning he went to the caretaker, and he described what had happened to the caretaker, and the caretaker immediately recognized that what he heard, what this witness heard, sounded like the ghost story that was told about Bulliskin, which was that there was someone who had their head chopped off, and the head was thrown down this hall, the very hall that he claimed to. He thought it was the cat's. Well, this caretaker kind of set him straight, and from what I remember, I think that was the last night that this guy stayed in the mansion, and I wonder whether it didn't test his abstinence from drugs and alcohol. The interesting story for me, part of the story is, though, the reporter responds to Jimmy Page, did you ever hear this supposed head roll down the hall? And Jimmy Page said, no, I never did. And then the reporter responds and says, oh, so you don't think there's you never witnessed any paranormal activity there? And Jimmy Page said, no, I didn't say that. I said I didn't hear the head roll down the hall, which leads you to suspect that he had his own run-ins with the paranormal there. But who knows?
Sure. Yeah, it certainly would lead you in that direction. It's funny you mentioned, as I was going through the book, I kind of had that thought as well that, if these were personal experiences of some of these rock and rollers, especially if we're talking 60s and 70s time frame, how much of this was drug induced. Of course, you can't help but kind of go down that road a little bit when you're thinking about
it's one of the hazards of telling these ghost stories. But I have to be honest with you. When I started writing these ghost stories, I was more looking for entertainment value, for historic value. But I've since moved on, and I think through really speaking to hundreds of people about these ghost stories, overall there's this debate that goes on about these ghost stories, which is people are looking for proof. They want, when you tell these stories, the skeptics are always going to knock it. The believers are always going to believe it. But see, I think the real fundamental lesson about all of these ghost stories, no matter what I wrote, is not about proof, but it's about meaning. Why do we tell these ghost stories? And some of them, I think, are simply ghost lore. They're just good, old-fashioned ghost stories that we like to tell. Then there's another element of these ghost stories that I think are, people have had experiences that they can't explain, and they very quickly try to create their own narratives to classify them and to get a grip on it. So it really, to me, becomes about meaning. If tomorrow someone told me all these ghost stories are fake and there's no truth to them, I wouldn't care, because I still think that they're important. They tell us a little bit about ourselves, and they tell us a little bit about, when we come to grips with a reality we can't understand. We can't, hone it with our rational side. I think no matter what, and the ghost of rock and roll, I have talked about this, and a lot of people will roll their eyes, and some people will be fascinated, but all of that is kind of meaningful to me, because the way you react to these tells me a little bit about your approach to this kind of greater reality.
Absolutely. There's another rock and roll legend here covered in the book, and that is the legend of Jim Morrison, the singer and frontman of the Doors. And interesting story covered here. I mean, there was a couple of different accounts about people that think they may have witnessed his spirit. But this is kind of a strange one, but an interesting one as you delve down further into it. And this is an LA Mexican restaurant, so a Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles County, where people have said they've spotted the spirit of Jim Morrison, the ghost of Jim Morrison, and in a few different places, but of all places, in a bathroom. Now, the interesting thing about this one is as I read further into the book, it sounds like it was located right where one of the studio recording rooms was, where the Doors had recorded. But can you touch a little bit on that and the accounts about Jim Morrison?
Again, just to kind of tell you a little bit about the genesis of this book, I really thought when I was starting to look in to try to find these Jim Morrison ghost stories that I would find Jim Morrison at some bar. Later on, I actually did find that he haunts a couple bars, which is kind of cool. But initially, the one that stood out was that he haunted this bathroom of a Mexican restaurant. The story is that this used to serve the building where the Mexican restaurant was, or maybe even still was the kind of headquarters for the Doors. And the bathroom was probably where the vocal booth that Jim Morrison did a lot of his singing in. And a couple of the people claimed that when they went into the bathroom, they could hear it breathe. They could hear breathing, and they couldn't figure out what was causing it. Sometimes the doors would rattle. Sometimes the door would make noises, and sometimes it felt like the whole room was shaking. Now, the instant skeptic in me says this is just this owner of this restaurant trying to drum up business, by inventing a ghost story, which, God bless. I think that's a great idea. But actually, the story got out because the owner went out and tried to get a medium to make contact, and then tried to get someone to, exorcise the ghost. So if that doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who wanted to keep that reputation going. So that's kind of the story about Jim Morrison and the haunted Mexican bathroom.
Yeah, fascinating one indeed. The other one you cover in the book is, of course, Michael Jackson. And there's been sightings at his Neverland Ranch. And there's also one by his sister LaToya that believes she experienced his presence or his ghost in one of her residences. Can you talk a little bit about a few of the accounts that are associated with Michael Jackson?
Sure. Right after Michael Jackson died, of course, there were some stories that I found about fans who said when they were outside the hospital where he was rushed to, that they could see orbs of light around the ambulance and around the hospital. That was one of the stories. The other story is that I think there were actually two accounts, and this is where it gets a little confusing because I don't know whether both of the accounts are describing the same clip or whether there were actually two different clips. But regardless, there's a story that during an interview, one of the interviews I think was on CNN or maybe it was Larry King, that if you look closely at the clip, you can see a figure walking behind Michael Jackson's brother. I think it was Jermaine who was talking about his brother's death, and they could see Michael Jackson walking across behind. And people said that was the ghost of Michael Jackson. LaToya said that often Michael Jackson would stop by her house and would rehearse upstairs, and that even after he died, she could hear this tapping, like someone was tap dancing or someone was rehearsing in that room. Her dog allegedly would bark into that room like it was triggered by something or saw something. So there's a couple stories about Michael Jackson. Another one is that people could hear neighbors of his former home in Los Angeles could hear music coming from the house. They thought maybe someone broke in. They called the cops, and there was nothing there. So they think that maybe they had heard the ghost of Michael Jackson.
Wow. Again, just fascinating stuff. It's quite interesting. I want to talk a little bit, because you cover this in the book as well. You talk a little bit about this, the 27 Club. Some really, really famous rock and rollers who died at the ripe young age, of 27. A few that I can think of: Jim Morrison. I think Jimi Hendrix is part of that list. Janis Joplin. But can you talk about, who else is part of that club? And I think you mentioned some numerology and a little bit more of when people have delved into this, a little bit more perhaps significance to this.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting part of the conversation because we're going to go back to Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson dies at 27, and there's a lot of speculation among kind of rock occult lorists, of which I am one, that Robert Johnson starts the 27 Club, and as you described it, it's this propensity of particularly rock stars to die at the age of 27. And Robert Johnson is the first, but think about the people that we talked about. You mentioned Jim Morrison. Brian Jones was 27. Janis Joplin was 27. Jimi Hendrix was 27. We go up to the modern era with Amy Winehouse, 27. Kurt Cobain, 27. All of these folks died at this peculiar period of their lives. And there are just a lot of people speculate as to why this happens. Probably the one most prominent supernatural theory is that this is a result of that Crossroads curse. This is a result of Robert Johnson kind of creating the template of what a rock star life would be. There's others who say these people must have all have sold their soul to the devil, and that's why 27 seems to be the magic age. There's another kind of theory. It basically says that there's a point in a body where if you continually abuse it with drugs and alcohol and not sleeping and God knows what else these rock stars were doing, that eventually it catches up to you. And 27 is just kind of a coincidence. There was a study done, and I think it was done out of England, where they tried to take all of the dates that rock stars who appeared on the top 10 of the English charts from 1950 to, let's say, 1970, I think, or 1980, and they basically concluded there's no statistical significance of the number 27. In other words, people dying at 27 did not really stand out. But I'm kind of a research nerd, so when you look at the way that they ran the numbers, it felt a little like cherry picking to me, because first of all, they start the charts in 1950, and of course the rock era doesn't really start in 1957. In England, I think it was a little more delayed. A lot of these rock stars that we know are in the 27 club never made the top 10 in England. People like Janis Joplin. I don't even know whether the Doors ever made the top 10. So I don't know. I still think it's a little freaky of the number of people who die at 27 among that group.
It's certainly interesting that there's been that many, and that they've all passed away at the same age. They're at the ripe age of 27. I also wanted to talk a little bit, because this was a little bit kind of an outlying story here that I found really interesting. I cover a lot of the shows that I do on the Passion for the Paranormal podcast show. Delve into the UFO issue. I've had many UFO researchers on the show. I found it interesting that you had the story of Jim Sullivan, who it sounds like he was kind of on the cusp of breaking through and becoming a famous, perhaps, rock and roller. 1969, he releases a UFO-themed album. He was a UFO enthusiast. And suddenly in 1975, when he's traveling cross-country, somewhere in the desert of New Mexico, he seems to have a strange disappearance. And as far as I know and what I read, this has never been this story has never been resolved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was kind of a linchpin story for me, because I didn't know very much about Jim Sullivan. I just kind of stumbled on his story. I think was told by his son, and I think you kind of recapped it pretty well. Is that he was, I think he was an actor, a musician who was in L.A., and he had a fascination with UFOs, and he also really felt that he wanted to dedicate his life to music. So he had decided he was going to leave his family back in LA, and he was going to travel across country. And the way they describe it is just basically he took his guitar and suitcase, and he was on his way to try to become a musician in Nashville and then bring his family back out to Nashville. But inexplicably, they found his car with really no clues whatsoever. I think the guitar was still there, and a lot of the family members said that here is a guy who wanted to make a living with his music. If he was going to escape off into the night, he was at least going to take his guitar with him. But a lot of there was some speculation that the clues to his disappearance related to his desire about UFOs and his interest in them. And like you say, he recorded a song about them. And so there are some people who believe that he was abducted by a UFO. He drove out to this secluded spot in the desert and was picked up. That's one of these stories. But for me, this kind of unraveled what I explored a little more in depth in the next book, which is this connection between rock music, rock musicians, and UFOs. And John Lennon famously saw a UFO, and he wrote about that in his songs. He talked about it and was very clear that what he saw was something that he couldn't explain. It was he was in New York City and saw this immense orb of light come right over his apartment. And I think there's that line, there are UFOs over New York, and I ain't too surprised. That all related to it. Jimi Hendrix, according to his brother, was very interested in UFOs even as a kid. They claim to have witnessed a couple UFO sightings. There's this really bizarre story about how Jimi Hendrix was touring with Curtis Knight, and Curtis Knight tells the story that they were in New York City, they were in Upper New York at a gig, and they had left the gig right into a blizzard. Their car van wrecked into a snowbank. They were stranded there, and that later that night they kept the engine running, but later that night they saw this bright light appear in the highway above. Curtis thought maybe it was a Good Samaritan stopping, but he claimed to have seen a UFO that came up. Jimi Hendrix was sleeping next to him. Jimmy woke up, and what Curtis said, there was this kind of telepathy going between this strange figure that came out of this craft and Jimi Hendrix. Long story short, this creature managed to melt the snow, and they were able to leave. And so I know it sounds just absolutely bizarre, but this is a story that he told that I picked up in a magazine. But, Jimi Hendrix claimed to have seen and talked about UFOs in his music, in his lyrics, and, to his friends and family throughout his life. So that story, that Jim Sullivan story, really started this process of trying to classify all these rock star UFO stories out there.
You also cover a lot about, you cover some in the book about haunted studios, different locations and studios, and I know we're kind of running short on time. Is there any one of those stories that really you find the most interesting, maybe one of them that you could share about, a haunted studio and some of the activity going on there?
The one that stands out to me is, I think it's called the Robert Lang Studios. Again, I wrote this book several years ago, so I don't know whether it's there, but the Robert Lang Studios it's in the Seattle area, in the northwest, and it became very famous because a lot of the grunge acts recorded there. And a lot of these grunge stars claim to have had some just super bizarre encounters there. As far as there was one band, and I'm blanking on the name, but they were recording their Afghan Wigs. They recorded there, and they said that they were just having monumental problems with recording and electronic noise, and other people were just getting really bad vibes. And they called in a medium to try to see if there was some type of bad, evil spirits there. And she told them to clear out of the studio, and that she was going to have to perform some type of banishment ritual to get rid of the bad mojo. She did, and the band claimed when they came back that everything was kind of cool. So there are a lot of these recording studios that have ghosts that I cover. So yeah, that was kind of the one that stood out for me.
Interesting stuff. Hey, I know there's so much more covered in the book, other artists, some of them more, a little bit more current. I know you mentioned Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. We're a little bit short on time, but maybe down the road a ways we can have you back on, and we can talk about some of those other stories.
Yeah, I would love that. I enjoy talking about it. I sort of stumbled onto this, and I wrote Haunted Rock and Roll, more Haunted Rock and Roll, and then I actually wrote a book about country and Western ghost stories too. So they're all kind of connected, and I just want to leave you with kind of the thought that I have is that throughout the time immemorial, music and spirituality were connected. I mean, I would challenge you to name one type of religion that doesn't involve some aspect of music, whether it's chanting, whether it's rhythmic drumming of some of indigenous religious systems, fugues, gospel music, all of it. And so what I really think is, one of the questions that I had when I was writing is that why rock and roll? Why? And then it became why country music? And lately I have come to see that when you have these ghost stories, you kind of have a moment of transcendence, and that music is, and you, as a guitar player, you know this, and as a crappy guitar player myself, I kind of feel it too. There is something about playing music that connects you to higher levels of consciousness. That, when you're playing with other musicians, you kind of know what they're going to do. You feel like in sync with them. So I really discovered that probably these ghost stories, haunted ghost stories, aren't the result of excess drug use or anything else that's kind of thrown at it. I think it's because that music fans, and particularly music artists, the music is a tool for transcendence, and that gives people kind of the belief, the expectation, and the acceptance of these ghost stories.
Summed it up very well there. Matthew, where can people find your work, website, that sort of thing? Where can they find more about your work, your books that you've written?
Sure. I have a website, mattswayne.com, MATTSWAYNE. All of these books are on Amazon. Most of them are on Barnes & Noble, too. I would say that's the easiest way to get them, is either through those channels. You can actually go to your local bookstore, I believe wholeheartedly in supporting local. So you can go to local bookstores. They probably won't have these on hand, but you can tell them to order it for you, and they can do that.
Well, great. Hey, Matthew, thank you so much for spending the time with me. It's been a very fascinating discussion. And again, two things that I really love, paranormal and rock and roll. Thank you so much for joining me and talking with me. And you have a Happy New Year.
You're welcome. Happy New Year to you. And anytime you want to talk in the future, just give me a ring.
Okay, big thanks to Matthew for joining me on the show. I really loved that discussion. I really hope you enjoyed that as well. And like I said, some big things on the horizon for 2020. Really looking forward to some great shows. And thank you so much for tuning into the show. Happy New Year once again, everybody, and have a great night.